As we know, we are net importer of oil, and a big chunk of our oil import comes from the Middle East. And it is very unfortunate that this conflict is occurring at this oil-rich region on which almost entire global economy depends, because this area produces close to about a fifth or 20% of the global oil demand. And what more, the parties who are involved along the conflict, especially Iran, is located in one of the most important energy maritime corridors, which is Strait of Hormuz, which links Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. And along the coast of these two very important energy waterways, not only Iran, which produces close to about 4 or 5% of global oil supply, around 3.3 million barrels of oil per day, but also the two heavyweights in global oil supply, which is Saudi Arabia and UAE, which combined produces close to about a quarter of the world's oil need. And throw in, other countries which are also important producers of oil and gas, such as Oman, Bahrain, Kuwait, Iraq as well. There's about 7 or 8 Gulf countries in that region. So you can see how tense and how potentially devastating this conflict could bring to the entire global economy and supply chains, including Malaysia, which, as I mentioned, depends close to about 40% of our oil import comes from Saudi and UAE. So we can actually drop the word potential from your question, because the impacts are already being felt in a very obvious way. That we can already see the oil prices jump significantly, and no doubt that the price will continue to jump as the markets get more jittery with the prospect of the war prolonging and also no diplomatic resolution in sight. As we speak, oil infrastructure such as oil refineries and also port facilities have been subjected to attacks by both sides. And Iran, less than about 24 hours from the outbreak of the conflict, had warned ships not to sail through the Straits of Hormuz, which is one of the world's most important maritime passageway for energy. And that already is having a massive impact in the energy markets, which are obviously anxious that close to a fifth or 20% of global oil supply would just be stuck on oil tankers, which have dropped anchor and not taking the risk of sailing across Strait of Hormuz for fear of being attacked. So we are talking about that level of panic at the moment. So it is really time to be really, really worried about the prospect of how much worse things can get after this. Things are already bad, but again, as I mentioned, if there's no resolution in sight, things can get much, much worse. Obviously, economists would need to start, whipping out their calculators and work out some numbers, which is beyond my area of expertise. But I can tell you, without even crunching the numbers, it would be very difficult, in fact, unsustainable for the government to maintain the current subsidy, because, as I mentioned, we are a net importer of oil. And although, I think that it needs to be pointed out that although Malaysia is rich in hydrocarbon and fossil fuel deposits, we tend to export a lot of our crude oil more than we use them because of the low sulfur quality content. So we import our oil needs and energy in our energy mix. Oil import, fossil fuel still figure very prominently. So with the fact that the oil, which is the petrol that that are sold on the retail markets, come mainly from imported oil, it is definitely a no-brainer that the price sold at the local petrol pumps must reflect the current international oil price. So in other words, you can only continue with the subsidy so much until your pocket starts to be hit, and the numbers don't the math is not mathing, as they say, right? So that's something which the government has got to take into consideration seriously, because to prolong the subsidy despite the skyrocketing international oil price would just be an exercise in futility, because we need to at the very least not be too divergent from the oil price and with the vis-a-vis the oil which is sold. That is something which the government has got to take very seriously into account, because obviously a lot of work in terms of the working the numbers and also making a prediction on the direction of the oil price for the government to eventually decide on the price of our oil subsidy on RON95 and 7, also diesel to a certain extent. But all those parameters are no longer applicable because of the situation in Iran at the moment. So obviously, when the government fixed the price, it was at a time when oil price was at a quite manageable levels. But if we were to go beyond $100, even $120 per barrel, as predicted by some very prominent authoritative oil analysts, including J.P. Morgan, which actually came up with a $120 per barrel scenario should the conflict prolong and worsen, there is just no chance that we could maintain the current subsidy without incurring serious financial repercussion to the government's coffers. So there will be inflationary pressure, that's for sure, because the choking of the oil supply. We're talking about a fifth of the global oil supply here. So that is very, very significant. It will deny consumers, businesses, industries of oil supply cheap, affordable, competitively priced oil supply. If they have to pay more for oil, then it will add to inflationary pressures. It will shoot up the price of commodities, transportation, manufactured goods, all kinds of services, which will hit us in the pocket, and also will cause inflation that would render the forecast for GDP for this year, which is I believe around 4.3 or 4.4%, as unattainable. So I hope the people at Economic Planning Unit, or even those who are maybe certain extent Petronas National Oil Company, will start preparing for the eventuality of us having to hit the panic button if the situation worsens.